Welcome, I'm Fred Drummond, Director of Evangelical Alliance here in Scotland, and I'd love to welcome you to our hustings this evening. Over the last 10 years or so, since I've been in Evangelical Alliance, we've had hustings events at every significant election, and although this feels really strange, it's still something that we think is hugely significant. We believe that Christians should be involved in every area of life, being salt and light in local communities, from everything from helping out those on the margins of our society, to being involved in job creation, entrepreneurship, education. We should be involved in every strata of our society, making a difference and making our nation better, kinder, more just, and more reflective of the God who loves us. It's a great privilege to have representatives from 5 parties here with us tonight, and a great privilege for me to introduce our chair. But before we do that, let me just pray for our evening. God of grace and mercy and love, we thank you for your goodness to us. We thank you for the care that you have for each one of us. We pray for those who will take part this evening. We ask that you would grant them clarity and wisdom. And we pray that you would enable us all to listen with good grace and with understanding. And we pray that what we do would be pleasing to you, and that we would learn from you things that will equip us for the days that lie ahead. We ask that you would have your hand upon this event, and we ask you to bless those involved. In Jesus' name, amen. It is fantastic for me to be able to introduce our chair for this evening, Fiona Stewart, for a whole lot of reasons. One, that she's a friend, and she has been a friend for a long time. Fiona is a performer based in Glasgow, founder and creative director of Foolproof Creative Arts, a regular for Thought for the Day on BBC Scotland, also involved in the daily service on Radio 4, and a whole host of other things that you probably connect her with. She is a bright, clever, caring woman, and it's a privilege for her to call her a friend. And Fiona, I'd love to hand over the evening to you.
That's very kind, Fred. Thank you very much. Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome. We have 2 weeks to go. So whether, like over 1 million of us, you've already received your postal ballot and your pen is hovering, your pencil is hovering over the paper, or you're looking forward to a trip out the house to go and vote, then there is no better time, I think, than this evening to come and engage with some of these key issues that are facing our nation, and to hear from prospective candidates and representatives of the 5 major parties. Now, tonight's hustings will last only an hour, so I'm respectfully going to ask our contributors to be concise. I will try and keep you on track. I'll do my best to do that well. During the time, what we're going to do is we're going to cover initially the 5 priority areas that are identified by EA Scotland. So they are rebuilding post-pandemic, the environment, religious liberty, poverty, and addiction. So there will be some time to explore each of these issues, and then some time left at the end for some of the questions that have been submitted in advance, or in fact, you can do that through the comments stream, and everyone on the call will be able to see those comments and questions as you add them in. Please bear in mind that we do have limited time, and so we may not get to all of your questions this evening. In a moment, I'm going to ask our 5 guests to begin by sharing 3 values that they believe should be championed as Scotland rebuilds in the coming months. And then we'll move to our first question. So as they think about how they're going to answer that question, allow me to introduce our panel for this evening. I'll do it in alphabetical order. Alistair Carmichael is the Liberal Democrat Party MP for Orkney and Shetland. He serves as the Lib Dem Home Affairs spokesman. And as an MP, Alistair is obviously not a candidate for Holyrood in 2021, but he's here this evening in his capacity as chair of the Scottish Lib Dem campaign for Holyrood. Kate Forbes has represented Skye, Lochaber and Badenoch as Scottish National Party MSP since 2016, and since 2020 has served as the Cabinet Secretary for Finance. Murdo Fraser has been a Scottish Conservative Party MSP representing Mid-Scotland and Fife since 2001. He has previously served as Deputy Leader of his party in Scotland and is currently the Shadow Cabinet Secretary for Finance. Ross Greer has been a member of the Scottish Parliament since 2016, representing the Scottish Green Party in the west of Scotland. He was the youngest ever MSP to be elected to Holyrood. And Alex Rowley has been a Labour Party MSP since 2014, firstly for the Cowdenbeath constituency and latterly Mid-Scotland and Fife. He has previously served as Deputy Leader of his party and Acting Leader in 2017. Thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. So, to start us off, you have under a minute to tell us 3 values that you would like to see championed as Scotland rebuilds in these months. And I think we'll go in alphabetical order again. So I'll begin with Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Fiona. Well, my 3 values would be liberty, sustainability and unity. Liberty, because as a liberal, the freedom of the individual to live as they choose to live, as long as they do harm to no other, it is an important starting point for me in politics. And as you find yourself in a situation as we do now, very often we're tempted to take away these freedoms, as you see with the suggestion for COVID passports. Sustainability, we're in the middle of a climate crisis. We've learned in the last 12 months that we can live differently, and when we come out of the pandemic, the climate crisis will still be there. And unity, because so much of our politics in recent years has been characterised by division. That is not going to be helpful when we come to rebuild back our economy, our health service and our education after the pandemic.
Thank you. Kate Forbes.
Thanks. Good to join you tonight. My 3 values would be, first, trust or integrity, to restore trust between leaders and the public, between politicians and others, because recovery is going to require trust in these tough times. Secondly, respect between different groups, between different parties for what the other has to say, whether we agree with it or not, which is a rare quality in these days. And thirdly, seeing as this is an EA debate, allow my 3rd value to be godliness, because I think that captures the self-sacrificial care and love for our fellow citizens that's going to be needed for the national endeavour of rebuilding, because recovery is not going to be a walk in the park.
Thank you. Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Fiona, and thanks, first of all, for the invitation to contribute tonight. My 3 values, firstly, security, because we've been through a really difficult time with COVID. People are really worried about the future and worried about their jobs. And I want to see the next government of Scotland with a relentless focus on rebuilding our economy and our public services post-COVID and making sure there is employment for everyone who wants to work. The second value is community, because governments can't do everything. People have to help themselves and help each other, but governments can enable communities to be stronger and help people to help each other. And that includes making more responsive public services like education and the NHS and local government. And the third value is liberty, because we should be free in a democratic and open society to have the right to express opinions, even if they are unpopular. And I'm concerned that that right of liberty is one that increasingly is under threat, both in Scotland and in wider society right at the present time.
Thank you. Ross Greer.
Thank you. My first of my 3 is love. I mean, some folk here probably listen to Bethel music. I really love the song Reckless Love. Everything that we do has to be rooted in a deep love for people and for planet, particularly for us as politicians. The choices we make have a huge effect on people's lives. If they can't see that love is the core motivation behind the decisions that we make, we should be questioning those decisions. The second is compassion, because that's our love in action. That's how we demonstrate it. And our political debate in particular, it shouldn't be dispassionate. People's lives and the future of this planet should be emotive issues. And the last year of pulling together, rediscovering community, I think has really demonstrated the power of compassion. And my third is internationalism, because no one's safe from COVID until we're all safe. And that's the case globally. No individual country is safe until the whole world is safe. Our national rebuilding plan has to take that and our wider place in the world into account.
Thank you. And finally, Alex Rowley.
Thank you, Fiona. Yeah, I would say honesty, kindness, and humility. I think in terms of politics, if as a society you reach a point where you don't believe and you can't trust your politicians, then you're in serious trouble. So I think honesty is important. Kindness should start within political parties, because often people are not kind to each other within political parties, and they're certainly not kind to each other across the political spectrum. And how can you set an example then of the type of country, the type of society you want to have if your own politicians in your parliament is not kind even to each other? And humility, because I think we all need to have a bit of humility and be able to work together and accept that we can do better when we come together and when we work together. So that would be mine, Fiona.
Thank you. And I'll stay with you for the beginning of our set of questions, Alex, if I may. We want to talk about rebuilding. That's the first topic that we're coming to. What would you say were the main areas we need to tackle first as we move out of the pandemic?
I think we are facing an economic crisis. I think we are facing a lot of unemployment. And when I think back to the unemployment of the 80s and what that did, the social impact that had on communities up and down Scotland, we can't allow that to happen again. We have massive waiting lists in terms of our NHS, a lot of people that have appointments cancelled, a lot of people that haven't followed through to get their health checked up. And obviously our kids have gone through the last year with very little education. So building back in terms of those three and ensuring that we don't get the levels of unemployment that we saw in the 80s, that indeed some communities today are still struggling from, that would be my priorities.
Thank you. Same question, Ross Greer, to you, please.
Thanks. I think it's absolutely key that we don't think of this as going back to our old normal. That would be a failure if we go back to what we had before COVID. 1 in 4 children in Scotland lived in poverty before this pandemic, and our climate was in crisis. So that's why the Greens are asking people to vote like our future depends on it in this election, because it really does. We need to rebuild in a way that's fairer and greener than what came before. So that's why we've put out plans to create 100,000 jobs, building warm homes, expanding our railways, growing our renewable energy infrastructure. These are jobs that will lift families out of poverty while tackling the crises that we face. Beyond jobs, though, the major priority for us has to be education, as Alex said. The last year's really shown the weaknesses of our education system, despite the heroic efforts of teachers, other school staff, pupils, and families across the country. We saw, for example, in the exam shambles last year, the inbuilt structural inequality that our education system has that makes it much harder for working class young people to succeed. So we need to see huge investment in our schools, but we also need to see reform to make it easier for teachers and other school staff to actually do their job and to support children and young people the way we all want them to be supported if they're to succeed in life.
Thank you. Murdo Fraser?
Thank you. I suspect there might be a degree of consensus around quite a lot of this. I'm going to start off by agreeing with the two previous contributors. I think rebuilding the economy is absolutely fundamental, and we have to see a focus on that. I think one of the really interesting consequences of COVID is I think working patterns are going to change. A lot of people have got used to working from home, and I think that will be a long-term change. More people will work from home, at least on a part-time basis, and that's probably quite a good thing. It's good for the climate if people are not commuting. It's probably good for work-life balance. But to make that happen properly, we need to have, for example, much better broadband connectivity for people's homes. And as somebody who's a parent who's been struggled over the last year with children trying to home distance learn while two parents are working remotely, I know what a challenge that's been. So if we're going to see these changes, we have to have the infrastructure in place. And then, as I've mentioned, education, I'll add that in because that's fundamental. Because even today, I was talking to upper school pupils who are really frustrated at what's happened in schools. They've really missed out over the past 12 months. They're now being told they'll be sitting exam-style assessments in the next month, but with very little preparation and no study leave, and they're really concerned by that approach. So I think they've been badly let down, and I think we need to see a focus on supporting those in education who've fallen behind over the past year.
Kate Forbes, would you like to?
Yes, thanks. I mean, I think over the pandemic, there's been much talk about how it has highlighted what our priorities are as a country, as communities, as households. And there's been a lot of positive interventions with people looking out for one another. But there's also been huge levels of isolation, of loneliness, of worry, of fatigue, of fear. And, you know, I could talk at length about the need for certain public services to reach these people. But actually what I think is required is social recovery and social restoration. We were created to be sociable creatures. That has been denied to us significantly for the last year. And so being able to restore us to the sociable people that we were created to be, I think is one of the most important elements of this. I don't think economic recovery and social recovery are mutually exclusive. You do need a thriving economy with good, well-paying jobs to aid that social recovery and to resolve some of the structural inequalities that we see. But if there's any recovery to pick, it would be that social recovery.
Thank you. And finally, Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Fiona. As Murdo said, you've got an alarming degree of unity here. And I think just about everything has been said, but since not everybody has yet said it, let me just add a little bit extra to it. I think I would take as my starting point looking at those who have suffered most as a consequence of the pandemic. And like others, I would identify the young people as being those who have suffered most, you know, and it's actually, I think, a very encouraging thing for the future of our society that young people, for example, have very willingly taken their place at the back of the queue for vaccinations. That's something that they've been prepared to do without complaint in order to help protect the older, more vulnerable people in our society. And they are the people who are going to be paying down the debt in their working life that we've accrued in order to tackle this quite extraordinary episode that we've lived through. I think if I look at health services, we are already seeing horrendous backlogs for those who have suffered in very acute conditions like cancer care, for example. Mental health, I think, is probably going to be the single biggest explosion on the health service that we're going to have to contend with. And, you know, that is going to be something that's going to require a lot of first principles thinking, because we don't even yet know the nature and scale of the problem that we're going to be dealing with, let alone how we are going to be meeting it. And then, of course, there is going to be the economy, because, you know, unless you have got people able to go into secure employment where they are productive and earning decent salaries, then yes, the problems of mental health are only going to get worse. The problems of exclusion and isolation that Kate touched on there are also only going to get worse. The danger as we rebuild the economy, I think, will be that government thinks, well, that's it, we've done it now, we can turn off the taps. You know, we've got businesses and businesses that employ significant numbers of people that will need ongoing support for quite some time to come. And the idea that there's one size that's going to fit every business, so it is just laughable. So we're going to have that flexibility and creativity in government, wherever it is to be found. And if I may say so, I think that means that communities, the diverse range of communities, urban communities, rural communities, island communities, coastal communities, should all be allowed to lead the way in their own recovery. This has got to be a recovery that's built from the community up, not the centre out.
Thank you. We're going to move on to our second topic. There are comments coming in on the comments thread, and a number of the questions that are being asked we will be dealing with as we go on. We're going to move on to the topic of the environment. It's Earth Day today. COP26 is coming to Glasgow in November. World leaders today have been meeting in a virtual summit. Clearly, this is an area of concern, not just for Scotland. But what is the biggest move a government can make to effect climate change is my initial question, and then we have a question that was sent in advance around biodiversity. If I could just read this to you. The greatest long-term environmental destruction which has taken place in Scotland is the removal of natural woodland, including the Caledonian pine forest. Much of Scotland is now given over to game shooting, which deliberately burns huge areas of Scotland and prohibits regeneration, the proven greatest driver of biodiversity. What would you do to reverse this process? So 2 questions there. If you can keep your answers fairly short, what's the biggest move that a government can make to affect climate change? And secondly, what can we do to reverse this process that is stopping biodiversity? So Murdo Fraser, if I can start with you, please.
Okay, thanks very much. I mean, first of all, climate change is a huge issue for everyone. The UK government this week announcing substantial, exciting, new ambitious targets for reducing carbon emissions. I think we should applaud that. What governments can do, governments can engage with people to help them make the right choices, because a lot of this will be driven by government, but a lot of it will be driven by people's choices. So, let's take an example of transport infrastructure. Now, we're saying in our manifesto, at least 1/10 of transport spending in future should go on active travel. So encouraging people to walk and cycle more, encouraging the reopening of rail lines that have been closed, improving connectivity and reducing journey times between the north of Scotland and the Central Belt. I think that would be a major advantage in shifting people out of motor cars onto public transport, and also encouraging people down the route of active travel. On your second point, I just don't agree with this argument that grouse moors are a bad thing for the environment. I actually was visiting a Highland estate just last week. There's rich biodiversity on a moor that is there because it is managed. It is managed in a way that provides employment for people in a rural area. And I don't think just leaving rural Scotland to go back to wilderness is either good for the economy or good for biodiversity. So I don't accept that basic argument. I think Scotland can benefit from substantial increased tree planting, and that's in our manifesto too. Bringing back native woodlands as part of that is really important too. But we need to have a mixed economy, and including upland and moorland estates is an important part of that rural economy.
Thank you. Ross Greer.
I'm hoping you can hear me now, but I can't hear or see any of you anymore. So Fiona, interrupt me if it gets the connection breaks down. The climate crisis is by far the biggest crisis that we face, and we need to be bold. This is the last election we've got in Scotland where we'll have a full 5-year term of Parliament to tackle it, because we've only got 9 years left before the tipping point. And Christians in particular should demand that we be bold about this, because we know who created creation. It's a gift that we've been given and a responsibility. We don't own it. We're the stewards of the earth, not its owners. We can't do whatever we wish with it. And to pick up on what Murdo was saying, I think it's unjust to be putting the burden on individuals. 90 companies are responsible for 2/3 of all global emissions, not even in the last decade or century, but since the beginning of the industrial era. People, individuals, are trapped in systems they didn't create, and the poorer you are, the more trapped you are in those systems. So it's about government and corporations taking action. And what can the government in Scotland do? Well, transport's the #1 area. Our transport emissions are actually going up. Scotland isn't hitting its climate targets because transport emissions are going up. So the Greens have delivered free bus travel for young people. Everyone under 22 will be able to travel on the bus for free from this summer onwards. But our plan for job creation is really focused on expanding our railways. We can create at least 17,000 jobs through expansion of the railways, making public transport accessible to communities that simply don't have it at the moment. And on the second question, we do face a nature emergency. 1 in 9 of Scotland's species is at risk of extinction. The Greens secured a £10 million nature restoration fund last month. We want to go much further than that. We need £150 million for nature restoration, and we would ban grouse moors. They are just about the most economically unproductive thing that you can do with that land. We could create far, far more jobs through forestry, through rewilding. There are far more economically valuable things that you can do with the land that actually has a positive impact on the environment than just allowing huge tracts of Scotland to be used by a tiny number of very rich people for blood sports.
Our alarming degree of unity has broken down. Alex Rowley, what would you say in response to those questions?
Well, I think we've had all these different outlines of what government can do, and there's a lot that government can do, and as individuals, we can do a lot as well. But if you wanted me to say the main thing that government can do, I think looking at, for example, today and President Biden setting out a completely new agenda for the United States and urging other countries to come on board, because this is a global problem. It is a global issue and the solutions will be global. And so whilst we would not encourage more coal fire stations, for example, in Scotland or the UK, if we have Germany saying that they're going to continue to burn coal until 2035, we have China opening new coal stations every week per stations. So it needs a global approach, and I'd like to see our government in Scotland and at a UK level working with governments across the world, encouraging all countries to do what they need to do in terms of climate. And likewise on biodiversity, I would like to see a lot more powers going to the local level and the regional level, so that you have regional priorities and regional planning on addressing the issues that are there. So those would be the approaches that I would take. Thank you.
Thank you. And Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Fiona. I'm a farmer's son. I live in an agricultural crofting community, and one of the maxims by which I know a lot of farmers live is that you work as if you're going to die tomorrow and farm as if you're going to live forever. And I think that's kind of the approach that we have to take now to the climate crisis, because one of the frustrations of politics and government is that we tend to see life in sort of blocks of 4 or 5 years at a time. And what we need to have is politics that is able to build a consensus, so that politicians and governments can take decisions that are you're not going to see the benefit of them for maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 years, but that they are the right and necessary things to do, and that we have to start doing them now. So that's not policy, that's just a very different, and for many of us, I'm afraid, a counterintuitive way of going about doing politics. I think as well, you've seen some of the tension here already tonight about the needs and wishes of people in rural communities versus people in urban communities and the rest of it. I think my starting point for building meaningful responses is one that has to be built in the community and then built upwards. And as Alex touched on there, you don't stop at your own national boundaries. This is a global crisis, and global crises are only ever going to be met by international multilateral action. So as a country, we've got to be outward looking, we've got to be prepared to engage and contribute and to persuade other people. And I think, you have to see that synthesis between people and governments. So we educate the individuals to want to have an electric car, for example, and that's something that we all as individuals can do. But at the same time, there's a role for government in putting all the charging points in there, so that if you have an electric car, you can use it with some confidence. It has to be a multifaceted, multilateral approach to it.
Thank you. And finally, Kate Forbes, apologies.
Thanks very much. Well, there is a lot to do. We've got some really tough statutory targets, net zero by 2045, which is accompanied by a plan to deliver it. But it's not going to be easy. It's going to be tough. So it's worth doing. We have made good progress, which is thanks to the good people of Scotland, and it is worth reflecting on that, because sometimes it can feel like it's just an uphill battle, but we should look at how far we've come although there is further to go. The Committee on Climate Change has said that the Scottish economy has decarbonised faster than any G20 economy since 2008. That's down to choices that all of us make on a daily basis. I think we need to look at it as what economic opportunities are available to us by pursuing these that reduction in climate change, the climate change targets. We need economic opportunities coming out of the pandemic. We see them already. 97% of our electricity being generated by renewable sources 2 years ago. And we've just opened up the process for offshore wind as well. That will create a supply chain, which we hope will create jobs as well. So we shouldn't be pitting the economy against tackling climate change. We should see the opportunities that come with it. If there's one thing I'd choose, it's transport. Transport is far and away one of the hardest areas to deal with, but one of the most pressing. And it's not about stopping people, but it's about helping them, making sure transport is more accessible. And of course, I speak to you from a very rural part of the country where we need to be able to commute, and there's long distance transport. How are we going to do that? Well, one way is to invest in improving bus infrastructure, to remove the majority of fossil fuel buses from public transport in Scotland by 2023 and invest 120 million in zero emission buses. So that's just one example. And I'm going to stop now because you asked for short answers.
Thank you very much. If you will stay with me though, because I'm going to ask you first on our next section. We're halfway through. We still have 3 sections to get through. There's a bit of chat going on in the comment section. That's fantastic to see that. I'm going to move on to a topic that I think is probably of interest to a lot of people on this call in particular, which is religious liberty. It would be fair to say, I think at the present time, there is some suspicion amongst some people of faith towards politicians. They feel that on the one hand, the work within their communities is accepted, but on the other, the ability to share faith and hold another worldview is being marginalised. How would you respond to that? And then I have a second question, which is around would an independent Scotland have a negative or a positive effect on freedom of conscience, speech and religion? So Kate Forbes, we'll start with you.
Well, freedom of religious liberty. Look, I am a politician who also has a faith that's well known. So if there's anybody who has to navigate some of the challenges of holding those two things together, then you're talking to the right person. And there's others on this call that will also recognise that. But all of us recognise the importance of freedom of speech, freedom of expression. Now, you know, there's been a recent big debate on all of this in terms of a hate crime bill and the hate crime legislation in particular. We've had hate crime in this country for a long time in terms of the legislation because we think, hopefully we all agree, that racism is wrong. We hopefully agree that hate crime at the expense of other minorities, particularly I can think of disabled people or some religious minorities, is wrong. So when it comes to being a person of faith, I think we absolutely need to speak up, to speak out, to be heard, and to not let, not to be cowed in speaking out. And that is so important. You lose democracy if you lose the ability to speak your mind. And you know, politics is essentially debate. To have debate, you need to have at least 2 people who disagree. If you can no longer disagree well, you no longer have a democracy. So, you know, those of us on this call are regularly involved in that kind of discussion and debate. But at the same time, we have got to protect people. I'm sure some Christians feel under threat at times. Some Christians feel like minorities. We believe we should be protected when it comes to certain things. So the recent hate crime bill and the debate around it is probably a good example, where it's actually one of Murdo's colleagues that ensured there was a clause in that hate crime bill that allowed you to still give offence, that it wasn't a criminal offence to give offence to others. And I think that captures it. In terms of the second question around whether an independent Scotland would be good or would be bad, well, clearly I am supportive of powers being in Scotland and the people of Scotland being the best people to make decisions about this country's future. Ultimately, your political leadership is only as good as the people that you elect and the people that go forward for election. So liberty has got to be at the heart of all of this. I agree. I think it was Murdo and some others that talked about the importance of liberty. Liberty has got to go hand in hand with kindness as well.
Thank you. Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Fiona. Yes, look, when I gave you my three values, liberty was the first one, because as a liberal, my starting point in politics is that the freedom of the individual is what motivates me and what is more important than anything else to me. But I gave you a very important rider to that, and it is the harm principle. So that in the exercise of my freedoms, I should not do harm to somebody else. That's the difference between a liberal and a libertarian. I think that is where the application of that harm principle comes, that does get right to the heart of the matter here, because I think it's right that anyone should be able to have and to profess the beliefs that they would want to have. But if you look, for example, at some areas of the Christian church who would practice gay conversion therapy, I think that is a harmful thing for people to be doing. And I don't think that that is a freedom, be it religious freedom or political freedom or any other, that we should be tolerating. So, I know that will maybe not be a popular view heard in some sections of this audience, but I hope that if you go back to Ross's first principle of love, then that is very much at the heart of Christianity, and I don't see how anybody can profess to be somebody who practices and lives the value of love if at the same time they're practicing gay conversion therapy. On the question of how it would be in an independent Scotland, I go back to the 2014 independence referendum, and I remember some church figures intervening at that stage to say that they were so pleased that the debate had centred around Scottish values, and it made me think this bit about how you ascribe values to a people. And it's a dangerous territory to go into, let me warn you. If you say that, well, community or compassion or whatever else is a Scottish value, does that mean that everybody who is Scottish holds these values? That's manifestly not the case. Or does it mean that only people who are Scottish hold these values? Again, that is manifestly not the case. I think it takes you into a fairly dangerous territory of exceptionalism. So I think, if you want to have the constitutional debate, then have the constitutional debate. But let's not try and claim that any individual nationality, any more than any individual political belief, has a monopoly on any of these values.
Thank you. Alex Riley?
Yeah, I would say freedom of speech, religious liberty, these are the principles upon which our society should be built. I think there's a balance. I don't think you can simply legislate for every outcome that you would like to see in society. So whilst legislation has its place, for me, and looking over my lifetime, I believe that education has played a greater role in bringing people together and driving out bigotry than legislation. So there is a use of legislation, but I don't think having a parliament that can legislate for every issue. In fact, the danger is, and it was very, very difficult with the hate crime bill, I have to say, because I had some serious problems with the way that the hate crime bill was brought forward. There was real dangers in it that it would have created more disunity than it would bring people together. And you put public services like policing in an impossible situation. So for me, that would be an example of legislation that was pretty poor and pretty bad legislation. You have to get a mix. The debate of late that has been around trans rights and versus women's rights, I've just been horrified by. Sometimes I think to myself, is this the Scotland that I was brought up in? My mother always taught me that you should treat others as you would wish them to treat you. I know that's not always easy, and we don't all do it, but that should be the principle that upon which our country is built. The question on independence, I think that independence would be economically bad for the country. And I think that impact on the economy would have a detrimental impact on people's day-to-day lives. So I would be bound to say that I'm not convinced in terms, I don't ideologically oppose independence. I actually think it is not the best way forward for Scotland and our economy, and therefore our lives and our communities. Thanks.
Thank you. Ross Greer.
Thanks. On the second question around independence first, I don't think independence automatically makes the situation better or worse in terms of freedom of conscience and religion. But one point I would make is what I want to see with independence is a written constitution and a Bill of Rights for Scotland, and the opportunity to codify rights. We, for example, need to have a right to housing in this country, a right to food. But I think that's exactly where you would also codify your rights around religious freedom and liberty as well. On the more immediate question, though, a lot of the concerns that were raised with me about the recent hate crime bill weren't about new offences. They were actually about offences that have been on the statute books since the 80s in most cases, and in a few cases the 60s. And those offences haven't, over the course of decades, had some massive chilling effect on free speech. You know, free speech isn't an absolute. Almost no one would argue that you should be able to shout fire in a crowded theatre, or that you should be able to threaten someone with physical violence without consequence. So this is about shades of grey, not black and white. And that's what made the debate around that bill hard for us, because there was no black and white, and it's very, very hard to judge these kind of thresholds. I'm more than happy to hear opinions I disagree with, including about my own faith. But there's a difference between that and deliberately stirring up hatred. And I heard the pleas of a range of groups of people who experience far more hatred than I do. Disabled people have been mentioned, particularly for me in the west of Scotland, though it was the position of our Jewish community and their representative organisations that were persuasive for me. They really felt they needed the protections that this bill offered. Sometimes government doesn't get this balance right. I was proud to vote to scrap the Offensive Behaviour at Football Act, because I think that did infringe too much on people's liberty, and there were no beneficial results from that. I think the hate crime bill has got the balance right, but if it doesn't, we can and we should amend it. Parliament's job doesn't end once legislation's been passed. We scrutinise how it's actually working, and if it's not working, it should be one of our top priorities in the next session to make sure that we correct that.
Thank you. And finally, Murdo Fraser.
Okay, but briefly on the independence issue, first of all, I don't support independence, and I don't want to spend the next 5 years rerunning the debates of 2014. So I'd really don't want to see another referendum anytime soon, preferably never, frankly, from my own point of view. On the issue of liberty, I think we had a lot of debate around this in the context of the hate crime bill. And first of all, I think that came forward with good intentions. It came forward, as Ross earlier said, people wanted to protect minority communities from abuse. But there was overreach, serious overreach, in the way the bill was presented. And even with the amendments that were brought in to bring in free speech protections, for many people, they didn't go far enough. And we remain to see what the impact of the bill will be when it's actually on the statute book and in operation, when people start making complaints because they have been offended by something somebody else has said. And we've already seen this development of cancel culture with people like J.K. Rowling and Germaine Greer being banned from campuses because of the views they express that are deemed to be unacceptable. I think we need to be very, very careful about going down this route. Virtually, everything, maybe not everything, but a lot of the values we hold as a society today were heresies when they were first aired. So the views people would have today on the rights of women, for example, would 100 years ago probably have been deemed to be deeply offensive. But society only advances because people are allowed to say things that other people might find offensive. And I think we need to tread extremely carefully if we're going to criminalize people saying things just because other people might find them offensive. And for minority groups, including the Christian church, I think that's a really worrying threat.
Thank you. I'd like to ask another question, really on the back of a number of issues-based questions that we've had sent in advance, and some of that has been appearing on the chat. We have received a number of questions relating to issues of conscience. issues around abortion, gender recognition, assisted suicide, and so on. We don't have time to delve particularly into any one of those, but I would love to know, I'd love to hear you answer the question, is there room within the Scottish party political system for individuals to vote with their conscience? And how would your party respond on matters of conscience? So, if Murdo, perhaps we could go in reverse order there from what we did.
Yeah, sure. Very fair point. I mean, the Scottish Conservative Party has always taken the view that these are essentially issues of conscience, and when it comes to votes on them in Parliament, they are matters for personal choice. So, whether it would be an issue like gay marriage, which came up a number of years ago, or abortion, then ultimately individuals would have the freedom to make these choices. And certainly in my own party, I know that there's a broad range of opinions in my own party on these issues. The party does not seek to impose a whip on people, and it allows people to express their conscience and their own personal judgment on these matters. And I think that's important.
Thank you. Ross, Scottish Greens.
Yeah, so by default, the Greens don't actually have a whipping system, which makes us unique amongst the parties. And there are issues, so for example, assisted dying or euthanasia, where the party has a position that is it's supportive of the principle, but that would be an issue of conscience if any particular proposal was put on the table. That'd be for individual MSPs to vote on it. There are other issues where that wouldn't be the case for us, though. So Murdo mentioned gay marriage, equal marriage for same-sex couples. That to us is a core Green value. So equality is one of the 4 founding pillars of Green politics. And for us, we would say, no, that's not an issue of individual conscience, because that's core to who we are as a party and what our values actually are. That would be an issue where if you were elected as a Green on a Green manifesto, you would be expected to uphold in that case equal rights. And that's what it was about. It was about equalizing rights for same-sex couples. So there are some issues that, yes, they're of conscience, but there are others, and LGBT rights is in particular one for us, as well as women's rights. They're not for individuals. We as a party have a clear position in support of equal rights.
Alex Riley?
Yeah, I mean, the Scottish Labour Party has and does accept that one, we want to be representative of our communities, and therefore that means a wide range of views and people coming into Parliament. And where individuals have an issue of conscience, then we accept that people have the opportunity to explain that position. But we would accept that there are votes that come down to conscience, and people should be able to vote with their conscience if they feel strongly enough on a specific issue. And that has been the practice, certainly to date. Thanks.
Thank you. Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, obviously, issues like abortion, assisted dying are very clearly cut individual conscience issues, and I think that any goodness help the party whip who tried to impose the whip on that sort of issue. What is interesting, though, is that in recent years, political parties have actually taken formal policy positions in a lot of these issues. And although in Parliament you maintain a free vote, parties do have positions, and that does influence the way the debate is conducted. I was interested to hear what Ross said there about equal marriage, because actually I was the Liberal Democrat chief whip at the point when equal marriage went through the House of Commons, and actually I took a very similar view to that which Ross took. I felt that this was an issue of equality. It was something in respect of which we had long-standing party policy, and my intention was that it should be a whipped vote, always on the understanding that in the Liberal Democrats, a whipped vote doesn't necessarily bind you absolutely in the way that it does in other parties. It just commits you to a progress of managing the differences. In point of fact, when it was discussed within the then parliamentary group, the view was that there were good, genuinely held, very often religious, but not exclusively religious reasons for not wanting to follow the collective view, and that we would and did allow a free vote on it, albeit a free vote that was, so I think, only 3 individuals peel away from the remainder of the group. The overwhelming number of people in the party did actually vote in favour of it. It's better if you can build consensus than to have to impose it.
Thank you. And Kate Forbes.
Thanks very much. Yes, is the short answer on matters of conscience. There is a free vote. I'm on record expressing some views that perhaps colleagues would disagree with me on, and I couldn't be a member of a party that didn't allow for some votes of conscience. But equally, we live in a pluralistic society. I'm a representative of my constituency. That means I represent people whether they like me or not, whether they voted for me or not, whether they, would you believe it, agree with me or not. And all of us on the call who have been representatives know that that's part and parcel of politics, of the cut and thrust of debate and of representation. Now, just a brief point. Often I speak to people in churches who lament what they see as a lack of representation on certain moral matters. And my encouragement would be, and perhaps it's a good one for this audience, to get involved. To get involved in either local politics. I know anybody who's here listening is probably already involved, but to get involved, to make your views known, to make your views heard, because ultimately we have a duty to represent the people in our constituency.
Thank you. I'm aware that our time is pressing, and I must say at this point that Ross has to leave at 25 past because he's got another hustings to go to. There's a bit of competition going on amongst our panel this evening. So what I would like to do is I'd like to bring our final 2 topics together. So we're thinking about poverty and we're thinking about addiction, very relevant, certainly to the part of Glasgow where I live. And I'm interested to know, what do you do? What do you suggest we should do to bridge the gap, the poverty gap that there is within Scotland? Now, that might be around financial poverty, it might be around aspirational poverty, or indeed digital poverty. And on the topic of addiction, is there a role for local faith groups in fighting addiction? And if so, how would you build on those links? So if I can start, Ross, let's start with you first of all, please.
Thanks, Fiona. And on the point, the second point first around the role of faith communities in this, what immediately leapt to mind for me was this year's moderator of the Church of Scotland, Martin Fair. His parish ministry set up a really innovative support service for people suffering from addiction in Angus. And for a year after they set it up, not a single person walked through the door, but they kept going. And they kept it open until that first person came through, because that's what they were there for. And the difference that has now made to dozens of people's lives in what's a relatively small community is vast. So absolutely, faith communities have a powerful role to play. In terms of public policy, though, we need to treat addiction as a public health issue, not a criminal justice issue. Criminalising addiction, criminalising the harm that's already been caused to someone just makes the situation far worse. On the wider issue of how we tackle poverty, though, and we know there's that close relationship between poverty and addiction. Well, last month in the budget negotiation that we came to with Kate and the Scottish Government, the Greens secured the rollout of free school meals for all primary pupils. That's going to happen over the next year. I've already mentioned free bus travel for young people. That's going to help families. We also secured cash payments, COVID support payments, up to £330 for about 500,000 low-income families across the country. There's a whole range of measures we can take. I spend most of my time looking at education. And I think we need to be clear and say that the attainment gap caused by poverty in our schools, it won't be caused by schools alone. We need to tackle poverty at source. That's why making sure that we're creating quality jobs, giving people the opportunity to actually get to them through reliable public transport, that's what's going to make a massive difference. But very briefly, finally, going back to the drugs issue, we're doing this with one hand tied behind our back in Scotland because drugs policy is reserved. It's the only area of public health that's still reserved. We collectively, most of us, an overwhelming majority of us, want to introduce stuff like safe consumption rooms because we know that will save lives, and our number one priority is saving lives. We can't do that because the UK government are stopping us from doing it. If they devolve drug responsibilities to Scotland, we will be able to save more lives.
Thank you. Alex Riley?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I do believe that drugs policy should be devolved. Not all addiction, of course, is illegal. And there are many people who suffer from addiction of one sort or another. There has been a cut over the years in the level of support that's available for people who are looking for support with addiction issues. So much more resource into the local level and local services to support people with addiction. the current drugs policy doesn't work. So I agree with Ross in terms of it's a health issue, it's not a criminal justice issue. And Scottish Labour does believe that we need to see far greater powers. Drug powers should be devolved so that government can deal with it, and actually deal with it at a more community level as well. In terms of poverty, the levels of inequality within our society have grown wider and wider, and therefore we've got to tackle inequality, and we've got to tackle that at root, and that means substantial change to the way that we approach our economy, the role of the state within the economy. If we're going to tackle poverty, then you do that by supporting people, getting them into decent paid jobs, getting people the education, the skills and the opportunities. And as a good society, we should be able to achieve that. But I believe there is a far greater role for the state in actually making that happen. Thanks.
Thank you. Alistair Carmichael.
Well, since the last Scottish election in 2016, 4,253 Scots have died as a result of addiction, and that's drug-related deaths at that. The rate we have is 3.5 times worse that you find in England and Wales. So devolution may or may not be part of it, but I think there has to be a better use of the powers that we currently have. Ross is right, we should treat it as a public health issue, not as a criminal issue. Personally, I would see a massive rehaul of the Misuse of Drugs Act. The prohibition has failed for decades now, and I think we have to break the taboo which you find across the whole of the United Kingdom, let me tell you. You saw it, Kenny McCaskill wrote in 2017 that we needed reform on drugs. He hadn't made the case when he was Justice Minister because it would have been a distraction from the independence referendum. Well, that shows why actually this is the moment where putting recovery first in every aspect of public policy has got to be our priority, and the danger of taking any other approach. I worked as a criminal court solicitor before I was elected to Parliament, and I dealt with principally 16 to 25-year-old young men. And, you could have put them down for the sheriff court in the same way that some people put their kids down for eating on the day they're born, because it was pretty well inevitable that that was where they were going to end up. So I would say, actually, the real challenge, or the real tool that we need to develop in challenging poverty and drug addiction is education. It's putting resource in at a realistic rate at the earliest possible opportunity. If you wait till these kids have gone to school or even to nursery, it's too late. We know who these kids are. We know the problems they're going to face. And yes, of course, there has got to be a role for churches and faith groups in tackling that. There has to be a role for all of us.
Thank you. Kate Forbes.
Thanks. Well, others have documented the challenge that we face when it comes to the drugs crisis. And we have accepted that a lot needs to be done. And it needs to be a national mission. I think it's one of those areas where government does not have a monopoly on the wisdom, on the guidance of how to deal with what is a very pressing challenge. And I can think of a number of Christian organisations, Christian charities that are leading the way when it comes to responding to the drugs crisis. Just to name one, Hope for Glasgow, which was set up to respond to the drug death crisis in the city of Glasgow. And therefore, there's a whole host of different organisations that need to be part of the solution. In terms of our own commitment for the next Parliament, we have substantially increased the investment, so £250 million, to support a range of community-based interventions, because one fix doesn't solve all the challenges. That will include primary prevention, it'll include an expansion of residential rehabilitation, but I absolutely believe it has to be done hand in glove with charities and organisations that are already working in this space. Briefly on poverty, although it's hard to be brief on poverty, we have seen over the last few months during the period of the pandemic a significant increase in claimants for benefits. Whilst unemployment has only risen slightly, that the claimant count has risen extremely, and it's never children's fault to find themselves in poverty. And that's where a number of our interventions are specifically targeted at trying to reduce child poverty. That includes doubling the Scottish Child Payment to £20 a week, money directly in people's pockets to try and bring children out of poverty, alongside expanding free school meals for this next period.
Thank you. And Murdo Fraser.
Thank you. Firstly, on poverty, to me, the two biggest routes out of poverty are firstly work and secondly education. And the unequivocal priority for the next Scottish Government for 5 years must be focusing on rebuilding the economy so there are jobs for people, good, secure, well-paid jobs. We have, with the national living wage, one of the highest minimum wages in the world, actually, in the United Kingdom. But we get people into work. Work is good for people, right? People find fulfillment in work. And one reason I'm very skeptical about ideas for a universal basic income is I don't think it's good for the state to be paying people not to work. We should see work as a good thing in itself. And the second thing is education, because we have a wide attainment gap in Scotland between people from better off backgrounds and children from less well off backgrounds. And that gap is closing far, far too slowly. It will be exacerbated by COVID because we know that too many children were not getting the support during home learning that others were, and it makes matters worse. So we need a much accelerated interventions in our schools. That's why we're proposing a dedicated catch-up fund and a national tutoring scheme. And finally, on drugs, Alistair was absolutely right to talk about this when he said, Scotland has by far the worst rate of drug deaths in Europe, far higher than other parts of the UK, where they have the same policies on legality of drugs as Scotland does. And this didn't happen by accident. It happened because there was a cut by the SNP government in the drug recovery programs and a cut in the number of drug rehab beds that is only now being reversed. So we need to look at how we support these initiatives, support rehabilitation, and absolutely there is a role for faith-based groups to come in as they already do. And what we need to avoid is any suspicion in the public sector of third sector groups, including faith-based groups, because they have a faith ethos. Because we've seen that in the past, and it stood in the way of great work being done because people have been suspicious of the faith background of those providing a vital service.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid our time is at an end. We have run out. I'm sorry if you have asked questions this evening and they've not been answered. There will be local hustings undoubtedly that you can connect with and ask those questions. Please do that. Thank you very much to our panel. Ross has had to leave us, but I was going to ask you to give us a one-sentence vision for Scotland. If anyone is willing to stay, if you're willing to stay on and you don't have to rush off, would you be willing to do that? They're a captive audience. Alex Rowley, would you like to go first? Give us one sentence.
There is more to unite us than divide us, and united we will be stronger as a country.
Thank you. Murdo Fraser.
Governments can do so much. Governments can help people to do the right things, but people need to be the driver for a better Scotland. And that means people loving one another and working together.
Thank you. Alistair Carmichael? Sorry, I caught you off guard there.
Sorry, yeah. Alex Rowley stole my sentence. I agree with Alex.
Kate Forbes.
Competent leadership matters as we embark on a period of economic, social, and spiritual recovery, not that governments can do all three.
Thank you very much to all of our panelists this evening, and thank you to EA for hosting this event. Please don't forget to vote. That's important. Please don't forget to keep engaging in all of this. And please pray for our politicians and our representatives as they lead us, regardless of the colour of their party. You can connect with EA Scotland Resources via their website. Don't forget to vote. And thank you again for joining us this evening. Thank you.